Welcome to episode 3 of The End of Antiquity, and if you're still watching, then I thank you very much. Hopefully you enjoyed the playthrough using the great battles of history in part 2 as we saw the Romans defeat the Persians. And that's where we last left off, with Belisarius having just defeated the Persians at Dara, securing the Roman army's position along the eastern frontier and allowing them to go on the offensive. Over the next several years, the Persians and the Romans would clash several more times, with the Lakhmid and Ghassanid Arab tribes who were rivals joining their respective allies in this campaign through Syria and Anatolia. And finally, on Easter Sunday in 531 AD, Belisarius' army caught up to the Persians at Callinicum, which is modern-day Raqqa, Syria. The Persian general Azarethes asked Belisarius to delay his attack that he was planning to make for the sake of the Judeo-Christian soldiers that were serving under him, allowing them to celebrate the holiday, so there was no battle. According to the Chronicle of Procopius, who was the author and historian of our main contemporaneous histories of Justinian's rule, and he was also Belisarius' legal advisor while on campaign, Belisarius' troops, who had been fasting all day in observance of Easter, demanded that they go to battle with the Persians. And the general was sort of bent over a barrel and had no recourse but to attack. Now, how much of that is sort of ass covering after the fact by Belisarius is unknown, but regardless, the Battle of Callinicum was a major defeat for the Romans and also a major Pyrrhic victory for the Persians. Both armies would be knocked out of commission due to really heavy losses suffered against one another. After this, Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople, and he faced hearings about this defeat. Justinian was not happy, but ultimately he was cleared of wrongdoing in the battle, because he blamed the troops for their undisciplined desire to attack, and also cited a possible betrayal by the Arab allies of the Romans. Regardless, this would be the first instance in a long line of military defeats, with Belisarius at the helm as a result of poor discipline, insubordinate commanders, or both tied together. And we're going to see a lot more of that in Italy. The ultimate political outcome of the defeat was more impactful to the Roman state. The Persians and the Romans, who were both very fatigued of war at this time, came to peace terms. But the Romans were on the hook for a very expensive, very harsh payment of tributary penalties to the Persian king Kavad. This was a perfect storm of misery on top of a pile of civil disruption that had been going on at home in Constantinople. While the war had been progressing, Justinian's administration had developed a reputation for harsh and relentless tax collecting, major crackdowns in corruption among the nobility and social elite, and reforms of the legal system that those same nobility and social elite had used to protect themselves from consequences. In addition, Justinian himself was seen as sort of a social pariah in those circles, thanks to his marriage to Theodora and his own low-status social upbringing, which we talked about in episode 1. With the expensive peace with the Persians, this was sort of a powder keg in the capital that was brewing. So if you go back to episode 1, you remember how we talked about the chariot races and their fandoms. I want to take a moment here and talk about the role that the sport played in East Roman culture. In short, chariot racing was like the Super Bowl and Champions League all rolled into one. It was the event that public life revolved around. And built around this enthusiasm were the teams and the groups of fans who cheered for one of the 4 factions. There was blue, green, red, and white chariot teams and fandoms. At this time in history, the blues and the greens were considered the better of the teams, and they sort of reigned supreme. But these organizations were more than just team cheerleaders. They were also a social organization, a political advocacy group, a religious community support group, and like the mafia, all rolled into one sort of social entity. Day-to-day social fabric among the populace was bound up in these sort of chariot fandoms. And they patrolled the streets, they carried out their own justice or crimes, and in general, they formed kind of a seedy civilian power infrastructure below sort of the administrative and government positions. After one particular chariot race in 532, a riot broke out. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Wow, is this the first time that violence after sporting events has happened? Well, it's certainly nothing new to modern society, that's for sure. And so in this riot, members of the blue and green teams were involved in a murder. And those people that were involved from those teams were sentenced to death for their roles in the crime. Justinian was fearful that the public were out of control in their bloodlust. He decided to commute the death sentences for a couple of the members of the teams to one of imprisonment instead. The blue and green sort of fandom's leadership demanded that they be pardoned and absolved of all crimes, while the nobles and the aristocracy of the city, they sensed an opportunity here to drive a wedge between the emperor and his subjects. For several days, the public continued to riot and burn buildings in the city, including the Hippodrome itself, and including the original Hagia Sophia, which was entirely destroyed. Justinian tried to address the crowd and placate them, announcing more chariot races over the next couple of days. But the crowd would not be pacified, and they demanded Justinian fire his corrupt senior tax collectors and legal advisors who had been running amok amongst the population and nobility. Foreign mercenaries at this point were turned loose to try and drive off the rioters, but by this time the fervor had consumed the city, and a massive crowd gathered in the Hippodrome. Justinian was forced to address them from the confines of the royal spectator box at the arena. Now, if you'll recall, we talked in episode 1 about the nephews of the former emperor Anastasius, who were next in line genealogically to assume the throne before Justinian greased some palms to ensure his uncle Justin would ascend the throne instead. Still rankled by a low-born soldier and then his nephew assuming the highest office in the land, it seems that sort of the gentry of Constantinople got together with the blue and the green team fandoms and convinced them to join forces and rally the public to raise the stakes on their demands. Namely, that Justinian stepped aside as emperor and let Anastasius' nephew Hypatius assume the throne. So at this point, Justinian stepped forward to address the crowd. He apologized for his transgressions against the populace. He promised to address their complaints and pardon the men who kicked this whole riot thing off, who were charged with the murder crimes that started this whole thing. As you would expect, at this point, the rioters were so committed that they would not be satiated, and they threatened to overrun the emperor and his retinue in the Hippodrome. Justinian, at this point, basically made plans to flee the city and to abdicate, but was allegedly stopped by his wife, Theodora, and shamed in front of the court who were present. And apocryphally, she's quoted as saying something to the effect of that she would never be separated from her purple robes, which was the color of the imperial administration, even in death, and she would never give up the title of empress. Now, perhaps emboldened by this attitude, or perhaps out of options, Justinian reacted quickly. He hatched a plan, and he sent his chief court official, the eunuch Narses, weaponless and alone, with a massive bribe to the blue chariot fans, reminding them of their quote-unquote friends in the imperial regime, and Hypatius' historical association with their main rivals, the green team. This gambit actually worked, and the blue team rallied their members and followers and left the arena. Now the crowd was successfully divided, and Justinian then sent Belisarius with a detachment of his guard to the gates of the arena. The gates were then locked, and professional Roman soldiers, including Belisarius, were ordered to systematically carve their way through the rioters, who were trapped in the arena with nowhere to run. In the span of a few hours, between 30,000 and 50,000 Roman civilians had been murdered on the floor of the Hippodrome. This event was a major turning point in Justinian's reign, to put it mildly. Having wiped away civilian opposition, he had brutally cemented his authority over the capital, at least for now. But it also seems to have changed him as a man. Moving forward from this point, he would always seemingly harbor a paranoia of being overthrown, which would manifest itself in the military assignments of his generals and the short leash and shoestring budget he would grant Belisarius for ambitious campaigns across the Mediterranean. He would also seemingly become much more openly pious, with huge amounts of money being spent on imperial building projects across the empire to glorify Christianity, including the modern-day Hagia Sophia, which would be the largest unsupported dome and most extravagant building in the world for centuries. But the emperor needed legitimacy quickly, quicker than buildings would give him, and nothing would bring that faster than Roman military victory. With peace in Persia secured, he turned his eye west to the former Roman provinces of Africa, now occupied by the Vandals, who had sacked the city of Rome in 455 AD, burning and pillaging for the better part of 2 weeks, and looting the city of its valuables and treasures, and finally erecting their own kingdom with that newfound wealth in the city of Carthage, from which their navy pirated the waters of the Mediterranean Sea unopposed. Now, up to this point, the Vandal kingdom and Constantinople had enjoyed pretty good relations. The Vandal king Hilderic and Justinian had a warm friendship together, and Hilderic even allowed the Romans to send Christian bishops to preside in Carthage. Now, this had the knock-on effect of resulting in a portion of the Vandal populace converting from Arian Christianity to Roman Christianity. And this actually alarmed the Vandal nobility and ruling class because it brought them sort of out of their sphere of religious influence. Hilderic's cousin Gelimer, likely at the behest of domestic political factions, overthrew Hilderic in 530, the same year the Battle of Dara was taking place, and he took command of the Vandal kingdom. With his Vandal ally in prison and his military restless with nothing to do and in need of a major win for his imperial legitimacy, Justinian used this situation as a pretext to do the unthinkable. Send an army to Africa, defeat Gelimer, and reconquer, I guess we should say maybe liberate, a part of Rome that had been out of the empire's hands for nearly 100 years. On the next episode, we'll cover the Roman expedition to Carthage, what was ostensibly a massacre at Ad Decimum, and then play through the Battle of Trichomarum, as Belisarius does in months what was assumed to take years.